straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. We take you inside the courtroom for the dramatic new developments in the Derek Chauvin trial. A key witness breaking down in tears as he watches the video of George Floyd's death.
Oh my God.
Is anxiety from testimony in the death of George Floyd causing jurors to feel sick? Plus, see video of George Floyd inside Cup Foods for the first time. The employee who flagged Floyd's $20 bill as possibly counterfeit says he feels guilty today.
If I would have just not taken the bill, this could have been avoided.
And we investigate, our prosecutors using the testimony from minors to try to seek a higher sentence if Chauvin is convicted. Law and Crime Daily, covering court cases from coast to coast. And welcome, everybody, to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Brian Ross, filling in for Brian Buckmeyer, who's on assignment in Minneapolis for the trial of Derek Chauvin. And with us, as always, of course, is Terry Austin. Day 3 of testimony in the death of George Floyd as the prosecution presents its case. Brian, you were inside the courtroom as the pool reporter. What did you see and hear?
Yeah, Brian, I was there for part of the morning and part of the afternoon as well. When I got in, I spoke to another pool reporter and saw a bit of the fact that one of the jurors actually had a bit of a panic attack or an anxiety attack as she described it. She put her hand up, she stood up, she put her hand on her stomach as I was told, and she ran out of the court. You may not have seen it if you were watching the live feed. You really had to be there to see it.
Well, clearly some powerful and gripping testimony today. Any reaction to all this from Derek Chauvin?
Derek Chauvin has been cool, calm, and collected the entire time. I'm sitting maybe 10, 15 feet away from him the entire time. He's writing down notes. He's participating in his defense. I can tell you as a defense attorney myself, when I see in between, for example, cross-examination and direct, he comes in and he's talking in Eric Nelson's ear. He's telling him, I'm assuming, whether or not there's something to cross-examine from this witness. And I can see Eric Nelson nodding his head in agreement as they're discussing this with the woman behind them, an employee or a secretary of some sorts, I believe. I'm not sure if she's a lawyer as well, but this is really a team effort from the three of them back there.
All right, thanks, Brian. We'll get back to you in a bit. In another powerful moment, prosecutors called an off-duty firefighter to the stand. Genevieve Hansen filmed the incident on her cell phone and can be seen on the city security cameras. The 27-year-old first responder says she heard Floyd pleading for his life when she walked up to the scene. Hansen says she identified herself to the officers and asked them if she could check Floyd's pulse. When they told her no, she asked if she could show them how to do it.
To Officer Tao, controlling the scene, I spoke loudly enough that I would think that the other 3 officers would have been able to hear me throughout the event.
How did Officer Tao respond?
He said something along the lines of, if you really are a Minneapolis firefighter, you would know better than to get involved.
And when you couldn't do that, how did that make you feel?
Totally distressed.
Still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, yet another tongue lashing from Judge Peter Cahill and how it might affect the prosecution's case. But first, we give you an inside look at the minors questioned in the Chauvin trial and what role they could play in its outcome.
Welcome to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Dan Abrams, filling in for Brian Buckmeyer, who is in Minneapolis for the trial of Derek Chauvin. And with us, as always, is Terry Austin. Brian, some more big testimony from the prosecution. What did they have?
We're going to call this witness by her first name only because she just turned 18.
What did you do when you first got there and we see where you're standing? What did you do?
I pulled out my phone.
And what were you doing to pull out your phone?
Recording and capturing what I was seeing. I heard George Floyd saying, I can't breathe, please get off of me. I can't breathe. He cried for his mom. He was in pain.
All right, Brian, you are there at the courthouse. What has been the initial response outside to the first couple of days of testimony in this trial?
Yeah, Dan, yesterday there was a much more of a crowd right where I'm standing now, actually. At the beginning of opening statements yesterday, George Floyd's family was here to take a knee with Reverend Al Sharpton as well as Attorney Benjamin Crump for that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a symbolic but also powerful display of how long they believe Derek Chauvin was on George Floyd's neck. We also saw protests after the court. You could hear them even from where I'm standing here just up the block. But today, a much quieter scene as testimony is rolling out in the court.
Welcome to Law&Crime Daily. I'm Angelica Spanos, in for Brian Buckmeyer, who's in Minneapolis covering the Derek Chauvin trial. And with us, as always, is Terry Austin. The defense is calling its witnesses now in the trial. But before we get to that, Brian Buckmeyer is in front of the courthouse with how the prosecution wrapped up its case. Brian.
Yeah, Angelica, day 12 saw the prosecution resting in front of the jury. Now, prosecutors called 38 witnesses over 11 days. Many of those were police officers, including the Minneapolis police chief. 2 spark-of-life witnesses were called to humanize George Floyd, including his girlfriend Courtney Ross and brother Philonise Floyd. The state also called top medical experts, eyewitnesses, and first responders in an attempt to show that Floyd died because of Chauvin's pressed knee into George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Chauvin is facing 3 charges of second-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter, and third-degree murder. Now, prosecutors could still call witnesses or experts after the defense's case if they choose to put on a rebuttal.
Just miles down the road from the Derek Chauvin trial, people are taking to the streets after the fatal shooting of an unarmed man. Police now saying the officer accidentally pulled out her gun instead of her taser. Law and Crime's Kim Johnson is in Minneapolis and explains how the Daunte Wright and George Floyd cases have a connection. Kim?
Angelica, family members of George Floyd have been showing up here every day in the trial of the former police officer accused of killing him. But on this day, they showed up for a different purpose, to provide comfort for another grieving family who's lost their loved one at the hands of police. Now, the Floyd family joined Daunte Wright's family in a press conference outside the Hennepin County Courthouse. Wright was shot and killed by police during a traffic stop on Sunday. His mom described the last time she talked to and saw her son.
Daunte put the phone down. I heard some scruffling. He got out of the car and I could hear the police officers and scruffling with him. Then I heard the police officer ask them to hang up the phone. They hung up the phone. 3 or 4 seconds went by. I tried calling it back to back to back because I didn't know what was going on. And I never imagined this is what was going to happen. I just thought maybe he was being arrested. And then when I called back, the girl that he had in the car answered the phone, and it was on a FaceTime. And she said, she was crying and screaming, and she said that they shot him. And she pointed the phone towards the driver's seat, and my son was laying there, unresponsive.
My Lord.
That was the last time that I seen my son. That's the last time I heard from my son, and I have had no explanation since then.
Brooklyn Center police officer Kim Potter allegedly thought that she was using her taser and not a handgun when she shot Wright. She has resigned along with the city's police chief. Now, civil rights attorney Ben Crump is in Minneapolis and is representing the Wright family. He said that he never thought less than a year after George Floyd died at the hands of police, he would be here again representing another family and calling for justice for another black man who died in police custody. Angelica.
Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. Should the Derek Chauvin trial jury be sequestered?
There's civil unrest, and maybe some of the jurors did hear about that.
The shocking body cam video of a police officer shooting and killing a 20-year-old man just miles from the Minneapolis courthouse. What the Brooklyn Center police chief is saying about the Daunte Wright case.
This was an accidental discharge that resulted in the tragic death of Mr. Wright.
Our legal analysis on whether this case could have an impact on the Chauvin trial. Plus, the continuing coverage of our investigation into the man seen in the car with George Floyd on the day he died. Why Maurice Hall is in jail on sex trafficking charges, and will Chauvin's defense call him to testify?
He describes that they had to try to shake Mr. Floyd awake several times.
Law&Crime Daily, covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome to Law&Crime Daily, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, in for Brian Buckmeyer, who's in Minneapolis covering the Derek Chauvin trial. And with us, of course, is Terry Austin. Week 3 of testimony in the high-profile trial. Now, the plan is to sequester the jury once they start deliberating. But, Brian, the defense is hoping to change that, right?
That's right, Jesse. Just about 10 miles from here in Brooklyn Center, a young man was shot and killed by a police officer. Now, that's a separate city and a separate police department, but that case seems to have implications here. The defense filed a motion to sequester the jury Monday morning. Attorney Eric Nelson says at least one juror lives in Brooklyn Center and others have connections to the city. He was concerned civil unrest there might pressure jurors to vote to not convict because they do not want civil unrest in Minneapolis. Prosecutors say it's a different case and different department, so sequestering the jury wouldn't be appropriate. Judge Cahill denied the motion and explained why he did so.
The jurors all are aware and were concerned about their safety because of what happened in May of 2020. The civil unrest that followed there. Not a big surprise that there's now civil unrest in response to this case, but I don't think that should heighten the jurors' concern. I think it's probably the same as it was before.
Still ahead on Law&Crime Daily, the police shooting of a man nearby to the Chauvin trial and the newly released body cam video. But first, will the man seen in the car with George Floyd testify? Where Maurice Hall has been in jail since jury selection, and much more that you need to know. Next.
Well, before the jury was brought in for the day, the man who was in the SUV with George Floyd appeared in court, telling the judge that he doesn't want to testify because he could be charged with a crime. Law&Crime's Anjanette Levy is here with the major update to the story that we've been following for you. Anjanette.
Yeah, Angelica, we've been following this for several days now. Maurice Hall fears he could be charged with third-degree murder or even more charges if he testifies truthfully about what happened that night last May.
The correct spelling for you guys would be M-O-R-R-I-S.
Maurice Hall, in a coat and tie, appeared in Judge Cahill's courtroom via Zoom from jail.
He has been provided no immunity, no protection for his testimony whatsoever.
So why is Hall so worried? George Floyd's girlfriend already testified that they bought drugs from Hall. On May 25, 2020, Hall was in Cup Foods with George Floyd, holding what appeared to be cash. He's also on body camera video sitting in Floyd's SUV.
I cannot envision any topics that Mr. Hall would be called to testify on that would be both relevant to the case that would not incriminate him.
Well, that's ultimately the court's decision, correct?
Yes.
Drugs were found in Floyd's SUV during 2 searches, according to Hall's attorney, and Floyd ingested drugs when confronted by police.
This leaves Mr. Hall potentially incriminating himself into a future prosecution for third-degree murder.
But Derek Chauvin's lawyer planned to call Hall to testify.
Any events leading up to Mr. Hall and Mr. Floyd's arrival at Cup Foods earlier in the day, where they were, what they were doing, Mr. Hall's interactions with Mr. Floyd in the Cup Foods, including whether either party gave the other a counterfeit bill.
Nelson said Hall previously told law enforcement that Floyd fell asleep in the SUV before police approached. The prosecution supported Hall's request.
What we can't have is an invocation of this privilege in front of the jury.
Assistant Attorney General Matthew Frank says he doesn't want to give Chauvin a basis for appeal if he's convicted.
Opposing counsel has suggested almost an alternative perpetrator. In that sense, with the third-degree murder, but there's also drug charges, counterfeiting, false information.
It's sort of a link theory.
Former federal prosecutor Gene Rossi says Hall's testimony only helps the defense. He also says Hall could possibly face federal charges for Floyd's death.
If what you did in a chain caused his death, even if your link is far removed, that could be a federal charge. And that is a mandatory minimum, Anjanette, of 20 years and a maximum of life.
Meanwhile, the hearing ended without a decision.
Thank you, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Judge.
Now, Judge Cahill said that the questions Eric Nelson wants to ask Maurice Hall should be written down in a draft form and presented to him by this Thursday. He actually called it homework, which gave people a little bit of a chuckle. That way, Hall and his attorney can review them. Then this issue will be revisited next Monday. Judge Cahill, as you heard, ultimately deciding which questions can be asked of Maurice Hall. Angelica?
Anjanette, thanks. All right, there's more of this we want to talk about. Terry, over to you first.
Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. Reaction pours in from across the country to Derek Chauvin's guilty verdict. Guilty! What it means for George Floyd's family, friends, and his legacy.
I'm not just fighting for George anymore. I'm fighting for everybody around this world.
Yeah. The former police officer transferred to state prison. What was that writing seen on his hand? And when to expect his sentencing hearing?
8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing.
Plus, the Department of Justice launching a new federal civil rights investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department.
I strongly believe that good officers do not want to work in systems that allow bad practices.
Law and Crime Daily, covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome, everybody, to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Brian Ross in our studios in New York, along with co-host Terry Austin and Brian Buckmeyer on assignment in Minneapolis for the trial of Derek Chauvin, where the verdict was guilty, guilty, guilty. And Brian was there for it all. Brian?
Brian Ross, the verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin was met with cheers throughout the streets just outside of the courthouse. Now, following those cheers, the next 2 or 3 hours, we heard speeches from different religious and civil rights leaders. We also heard from Minnesota Attorney General and President Joe Biden commenting on the verdict. And as you looked around the area, you saw that where there once was just a number of people having boards, plywood boards up on their storefronts, some people began to take those down. The family of George Floyd commented on what they had seen. One of George Floyd's brothers had this to say after the verdict.
You have the cameras all around the world to see and show what happened to my brother. It was a motion picture, the world seeing his life being extinguished. And I could do nothing but watch, especially in that courtroom over and over and over again as my brother was murdered.
The judge revoked Derek Chauvin's bail, and he was immediately taken into custody following the reading of the guilty verdicts. Law and Crime's Anjanette Levy is here to tell us what life behind bars will look like for the former officer. Anjanette?
Brian, typically a defendant is taken directly to the county jail after a conviction, but not this time. Derek Chauvin was taken straight to a prison here in Minnesota, likely for his own protection.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff.
Derek Chauvin placed his hands behind his back, and Hennepin County Sheriff's deputies handcuffed him and walked him out of the courtroom. If you looked closely, you could see writing on one of Chauvin's palms. He was taken to Oak Park Heights, which is a prison with an administrative control unit. Photos from the Department of Corrections website show what it looks like inside. Chauvin is in segregation, away from other inmates for his own safety, and the prison claims it operates at the highest level of security.
A police officer is not seen in a very good light in a prison setting. And I think a lot of them, they want to be able to make a name for themselves, have an opportunity to brush up against him in a hallway, in a chow hall, and have an opportunity to get their hands on him.
In Chauvin's unit, inmates are checked every 30 minutes and allowed to have books and toiletries. They also undergo mental health exams if they will be there for more than 30 days.
8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing.
Chauvin's lawyer declined a request for an interview, but issued a statement. Mr. Chauvin's case, including sentencing in approximately 8 weeks, is still ongoing. As such, I will not be making a statement at this time. Derek Chauvin was booked into that prison early Tuesday evening. It's not clear whether or not he will stay in that particular prison past sentencing, but it's likely his attorney will request some type of protective custody for him while he serves his time. Brian?
And Anjanette, do we know what was written on Derek Chauvin's hands in ink there?
Well, we've been trying to get an answer to that all day on our own, and I reached out to his law firm, and they didn't have any comment on that. But TMZ is reporting that according to Eric Nelson, Derek Chauvin had written his phone number, Eric Nelson's phone number, on his palm because anything he had with him when he would take it to prison would be confiscated from him. So obviously he wanted to be able to reach his lawyer and have that phone number handy.
Okay, and Terry Austin, what was your reaction to seeing this 19-year police veteran taken away in handcuffs?
You know, I think my reaction was a little different from when I heard the verdict. I think when everyone heard the verdict, they were jubilant and it was a sigh of relief. But it is difficult watching someone being taken off in handcuffs. I have to say, though, I think the jury made the right decision and they determined that he should go off to jail, that what he did was outrageous and that it should be something he should be held accountable for. And that means even as a police officer, he needs to serve his time.
That was the verdict. It was murder. So coming up on Law and Crime Daily, Derek Chauvin will be sentenced in 2 months and prosecutors are vowing to go for more than the maximum sentence. We'll tell you why. Plus, George Floyd's former girlfriend, Courtney Ross, is speaking out about Derek Chauvin's conviction. You'll hear what she has to say on the other side of this break. Derek Chauvin is set to be sentenced in 8 weeks, sometime in June, and could go to prison for decades if prosecutors get their way. Law and Crime's Anjanette Levy is here to explain how prosecutors say they're seeking to get a sentence longer than under the guidelines. Anjanette?
Yeah, that's right, Brian. And you may have noticed that during the trial, the prosecution called several children to testify about very similar facts. And that was by design, because the testimony of the children could help determine Derek Chauvin's sentence.
First of all, would you tell us how old you are?
9.
At that time, Memorial Day of last year, how old were you then?
17.
One by one, children took the stand to testify about what they saw the night George Floyd died.
Tell us what happened after you saw the ambulance come.
Yes, the ambulance had to push him off of him.
Did you notice anything about what Mr. Chauvin was doing with his body?
Yes, at one point I saw him put more and more weight onto him.
Prosecutors filed a notice last year to seek an upward sentencing departure, meaning they'll ask for a longer sentence than allowed by law. The fact that the crime happened in front of children is one of the reasons why a longer sentence may be sought.
The judge can depart downward, but he cannot depart upward unless a jury makes certain findings.
But in this case, attorney Eric Nelson asked Chauvin after closing arguments whether he would waive his Blakely rights and have Judge Cahill, not the jury, decide whether the state proved aggravating factors existed.
I'm willing to waive it and have Judge Cahill decide on those issues.
Former Hennepin County Public Defender Mary Moriarty says Judge Cahill could increase the prison sentence, but it's not a given.
Of course, if the judge gives an upward departure, that would be a ground for appeal. And the state wants to make sure they have a really good record establishing each basis for a departure.
Now, the state of Minnesota sentences people based on guidelines, meaning there's a range of sentences that could be given, unlike other states that have set sentences for certain crimes. There's a scoring system that's used based on a defendant's criminal record that helps in determining the number of years he or she should receive, and both the state and the defense will be submitting briefs to Judge Cahill arguing for both a longer and a shorter sentence. Brian?
Thanks, Anjanette. Anjanette Levy in Minneapolis. And Judge Peter Cahill explained to Derek Chauvin after the verdict how the next few weeks will work as the attorneys prepare their briefs for sentencing.
With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings. 1 week after that, we'll order a PSI immediately, returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing.
And Brian Buckmeyer, however much time Derek Chauvin spends in prison behind bars, time for a police officer in prison is doubly hard, isn't it?
It definitely is. They're going to have to put him in protective custody. I cannot see him being in general population. It's just going to be difficult based on where he is. And I think that's something that Derek Chauvin knew and understood. And I think that's why, if you recall, he wanted to do the 10 years if he could plead guilty to the murder in the third degree or a lesser charge, but only if it was done in federal prison. I think it's not only a danger for him to be in prison, but also to be in danger in a prison in a state or a county where he may have put a lot of people in that prison. So they're definitely going to make sure to protect him at all times when he's there.
And Terry Austin, in addition to the aggravating factors that Anjanette talked about with the presence of the minors, are there other aggravating factors that the judge will take into consideration, and how does he decide?
You know, it's interesting. He's going to look at the facts of this case. And yes, there are other aggravating factors where we might see this sentence go up. One of them is the fact that the individual was handcuffed and he was particularly vulnerable. And we know for a fact that he was in the prone position and that he was handcuffed and that people were on his back and on his neck. So the judge will look at that. And they're going to look at also whether or not there was cruelty involved and whether Chauvin actually abused his authority. So the judge is going to consider all of that in addition to the fact that this all occurred in front of children, and we heard that those children obviously came to testify. So the judge is looking at a number of factors, which is going to help him make his determination as to the facts, and then he will apply the law to those facts.
And Terry, Chauvin did not testify during the trial. Can he testify during the sentencing phase?
I don't think he will here. I think for the very reasons that he said it's up to the judge to determine whether or not these aggravating factors will come into play. It seems as though he has resigned himself to the fact that whatever has gone on in trial is going to be the determining factors. So I think we're going to just see the judge make a decision here, and in 8 weeks we're going to have a determination as to how many years exactly Chauvin will be spending in jail.
And once again, all eyes will be on the Hennepin County Courthouse in June when the sentencing is announced. All right, Brian and Terry, thank you so much. And thanks all of you for joining us here on Law and Crime Daily. We'll see you next time as we discuss justice in America.